So, a guide to the Architectural Antiquity. Hello, it's Jimmy, and today I want to talk about something I bought for some reason. I was on Twitter scrolling through, and I follow quite a lot of bookshops. One bookshop that I follow that I quite enjoy is called the Petersfield Bookshop. They post funny content, whoever runs it has a good sense of humour, and they're an antiquarian bookshop, so they mainly sell old collectible books. And one day I saw this book pop up. So it's called The Architectural Guide to the Neighbourhood of Oxford. And it's, I believe, over 150 years old. Fairly alright condition for a book of that age. And it's got some nice pictures inside, so let's have a flip through together in a minute. And another reason that I was interested in this book in particular is because William Morris, who is someone that I really like reading about, and I'm interested in his thought and his ideas. In his book, News from Nowhere, there's a bit of a throwaway comment having a bit of a dig at Oxford as a city and how there's some great architecture there. And Oxford does have stunning buildings and some really old buildings, but William Morris makes a bit of a dig and says that the more recently built buildings are ruining it a bit. They're not as good. And that's something that you hear people sort of saying now as well. A lot of people like the old buildings, but feel like, especially the ones built in the 60s and 70s, aren't in keeping with the vibe of Oxford. Anyway, I don't really know anything about architecture myself, but it is a theme, the importance of beautiful architecture in William Morris's thought, and in particular in that book, News from Nowhere. And I thought, that would be interesting to pick up this book that's looking at the architecture of the neighbourhood of Oxford, as it says. I'll find out a bit more about this place, which is important to my life, and that might give me a bit of a better understanding of what William Morris was talking about, what he liked and what he didn't like in architecture in and around Oxford. So I tweeted them saying, how much are you selling this for? And they said £30, which is a lot less than I expected, because I don't really know anything about antiquarian books. This is the first one that I've bought. And without thinking it through properly, I thought, I'll go for that. So now I've got this really old book, and I've got £30 less than I had before. But let's have a look at it and see what it's like. So I'm not sure how this is going to look, because I don't have an ideal setup for filming a look through a book. But you can sort of see there's this embossed image on the cover, and the title is there, and the same embossed image on the back. And if we open it up, you can see there is a little book plate showing that it once belonged to John L. Myers, and just up there it says John L. Myers 27204. So John got this book, I imagine, in February 1904. So it would have already been a somewhat old book by that point. I think this book was printed around 1850s. So I don't know, that would be like a book today having been printed in the 1960s or 70s. So they're not that old for John, but quite old for us. A guide to the Architectural Antiquities in the Neighbourhood of Oxford. There we go, there's a little map, and it says, published by the Oxford Society for Promoting the Study of Gothic Architecture. Oxford, John Henry Parker, some address, and then it's got the year in Roman numerals, MDCCCXLVI. So that's 1846, I believe. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. However, I think later in the book there's an indication that that was the date of an earlier edition. So I'll mention that when we get to it. Here it says advertisement, but it's sort of like an introduction. I don't know, maybe they called introductions to books advertisements, but it's talking about how the object proposed in this publication was stated at the outset to be to assist the members of the society in the practical study of Gothic architecture. So from what I understand, the main area of architecture that this society was interested in was the architecture of churches, and obviously in the Gothic style in particular. And from what I've read, flipping through a bit of this book, they wanted to promote new churches to be built in that style, and they wanted to teach young architects and historians and people who were interested in those things about how those had been built and to give them an understanding of the details. And the society became very respected as experts on this topic, and they hired experts as well. And I believe sort of contemporary architects of theirs would hire them and consult with them when developing plans for new buildings, and in particular churches that were intended to be in those styles. So they did have an impact. I mean, I think most of the buildings that they had an impact on won't be in this book because they were built after this book was written. But I would be interested to find out a bit more about some of the buildings that they consulted on or something like that, and maybe even go and visit them and look at the features of those and find features of older buildings that are talked about in this book and see the connections there. So that would be an interesting place to take this perhaps. So we've got contents and illustrations. Oh, so there is another book, another part called Introduction. So the advertisement, I guess, is more like the blurb. And again, it talks about the object proposed in this publication is to assist the junior members of the society in the practical study of Gothic architecture. Right, so here you can see this part of the introduction is labelled Oxford, October 10th, 1842. And by coincidence, that is my birthday, exactly 150 years before I was born, on October 10th, 1992. So that's a little funny Easter egg that I hadn't noticed. But the next part of the introduction is labelled being completed October 15th, 1860, which is after the date printed in the beginning of the book, which said 1846 or whatever it said. So I think that must be the date of the original, and this edition is a later printing from 1860 or maybe 1861. This is the kind of thing that's in there. So you've got this drawing of a church, and in Islip, in the deanery of Bicester, 100 of Plowley. I think hundreds were an old method of dividing up the country into different parts. So there's sort of 100 would be sort of like a district of some kind. And so it's got details, it's got measurements, and I think they went out and did a lot of these measurements and did a lot of these drawings and brass rubbings. So it's quite nice, all the illustrations, a little bit of colour, which is nice. I'm interested in how they printed these. Maybe they had to turn all the drawings into woodcuts or Probably not, probably more like brass engravings or something like that. I don't really know anything about old books. And look at these. These are so nice. And the colours are gorgeous. Just to think these colours have held up for 150, 160 years. They look lovely. So one thing I quite like in this book is that in each section, which is generally discussing a different church for a different parish or a different area, there's a part called Historical Notices. So in this section about Headington, which is an area of Oxford, but I suppose might have been considered just outside Oxford at the time it was written, there's a few pages talking about the church there and different features of inside and out of the architecture, but also things like the pulpits and things like that. And then there's this little bit, Historical Notices, and they talk about the history of the area, which is really nice, including how does it get its name, different things about the ownership of the land over time, from the Norman Conquest onwards generally. So this says, the old Roman road passes towards Headington Quarry Pits. AD 1009, King Ethelred kept the greatest part of his residence in this county, chiefly at Headington and Islip, and concludes a charter granting privileges to St. Friedrichs here. The site of King Ethelred's palace is said to have been partly in Court Close and partly in Mrs. Finch's garden, to the present road to Marston running through it. There was certainly some old building of considerable extent on this site, part of which was pulled down about 1820 near Mrs. Finch's barn, and some remains of foundations may still be traced in the orchard or Court Close on the opposite side of the road. So who is this Mrs. Finch? I don't know. So here's a nice page in Garsington. These are described as monumental brass of the Radley family, 1584. And here, in the sort of historical bit, it's talking about a building nearby that says, the founder's intention in this purchase partly was, quote, to erect a house there for the president, fellows, and scholars to repose them in when any plague shall happen within the university, an object which was confirmed by the sanction of the crown. The house was erected accordingly, with money provided by the founder, but not finished till after his death. It was occupied by the members of the college during the plague of 1577, not being finished in 1563, when they were obliged to retire to Woodstock. It is now occupied by the curate. So that's another little interesting tidbit where at first glance you might see an old building and you think, oh, interesting old building. But then once you start digging a little bit, it's a window into the history of the area and social history as well. So you've got, this is where the members of one of the Oxford colleges would have gone during the plague, or during a plague, to try and survive it. Lockdown 16th century style. But it also talks a little bit about how an enclosure of this parish was attempted in vain in the reign of James I. So I really recommend this book called Resist, I think. It's a Comma Press anthology. I'll talk about it more in another video, but it talks about different uprisings and resistance of authority and tyranny throughout British history. And one theme that comes up quite a lot, and there is a story in the book particularly about Oxford or Oxfordshire and the enclosures, and it's all about basically the enclosure of what was public land and turning it into private land. So yeah, there we go. Cool little old book from about 160 years ago. I don't know how rare this book or if there are loads of them flying around, but if there are not loads of copies, then I'm sure there are several people in Oxford who'd be really interested to have a look at it or get their hands on it. So I might try and find out, are there copies of this floating around in Oxford libraries and museums and archives already, that everyone who might be interested in it already has access to it. But if not, then I'll probably try and find a better home for it than my own shelf and try and give it to some collection that will make better use of it than me and give access to people who actually can study this stuff and get a bit more out of it. But in the meantime, I'm quite enjoying having a flip through it myself. So have you got any really old books? Do you think this was a really silly thing to buy? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.